Folks, if you love St. George, Utah, the way that I love St. George, Utah, you are going to love today's program. This is the St. George Real Estate Morning Drive. And I mean, I've got, he's going to become a dear friend. You know, I've not known him well, but he has known my father and his family and my mother for many, many years. Lyman Hafen, good morning.
Good morning.
Happy to have you here. We're
Great to be here.
This is a role reversal, right, for you?
Yeah, being on the other side of the table.
Of the table. We're putting him on camera today, and we're going to talk a little bit about his incredible podcast, which I've told so many people, if you're not listening to this podcast, you're missing out on some things. We'll talk about that momentarily. But again, this is the St. George Real Estate Morning Drive. I am Jeremy Larkin, your host. I've been at this, Lyman, for 13 years. And do you know how many times I've thought of quitting?
Well, I'm glad you didn't. You're doing great stuff.
Thank you. So many times. And typically we'll do this. We'll say, is this really working? Should we really be spending this money? Could we be doing something different? What if we didn't have to think about this anymore on Thursdays? And for 13 years, I've run this loop. So 13 years, let's see, Mallory, I need you to do some math for us on your phone. Our show is brought to you by Blueform Media. Mal's here. Mal, what's 13 times, we sometimes duplicate a show. What's 13 times 50? I could have done that math, but let's just do it. This is kind of fun.
650.
650 shows.
Wow.
And the stupid part is we weren't podcasting them for a very long time. We could have, or putting them on YouTube. We would just do them on the radio, like regular radio, and then they would just disappear into the ether. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, it does to someone like me because I'm from that old analog age.
Right. You know? Yeah. And so, we'd have a great show and people would enjoy it, and then it just poof, it didn't exist. So we're going to talk with Lyman about growing up in St. George, Utah. And he's a renowned author. He's not the kind of guy who's going to tell you he's a renowned author, but we know he is and has written some really fun things. And we'll talk about that. Guys, if you are in the zone and didn't pick up last week's show, let me tell you something. Jesse and I answered the question, is anyone really buying and selling real estate? There's a war in Iran. All the news is bad. Fuel is out of control. By the way, Lyman, it was $6.75 in California per gallon 2 weeks ago when I traveled down there. And we answered the question with a resounding yes. And this is part of today's show, is people want to live here. And if you have questions about buying, selling, investing, visit us at gostgeorge.com, GOSTGeorge.com, or Google the Larkin Group. All right, I want to get into the fun stuff. What year were you born? I know, but for our listeners, just for fun.
I was born the year Disneyland opened.
Okay, this is so good.
1955.
This is so good. Did you know my dad said he went that first year?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He would have been
14
years old.
He was born in 41.
That's
the year
great.
Disneyland opened. And I know a lot about that because I've been a Disney fan.
That is awesome. So the Larkin family went to Disneyland and when it opened.
They went that year.
Thing.
And my understanding is you paid per ride, kind of like a state fair, Washington County fair, right? You bought a ticket of some kind, something along those lines. And my gosh, was that a bygone? And I ask you that, Lyman, because I want to have context for a conversation, right? A few things have changed.
Yes, a lot of things have changed. Although it's so fun to sit here in your office, your studio, because you're capturing and curating and keeping so much of what's special about this place.
Yeah.
But I look out the window here at the cemetery, and it might seem a little bit
morbid
to have your office right across from the cemetery, and yet that cemetery represents who and what this town is.
Yeah.
And when you consider the people who are resting there, it's just dumbfounding.
Including my mother, including my Uncle Gray. Do you have...
We just laid my mom to rest 2 months ago, and I can see where her grave is from right here.
Oh, how fun.
And, I mean, there's nothing more profound about the concept of place than knowing where your ancestors are.
You know, when you and I talked on the phone 3 weeks ago, I told you about that red neon that says "Find Your Place." I loved this. You said something like that on the phone. We partnered 3 years ago, our company, and we won't get into any of this detail on the show, but I took the Larkin group, which was 18 years we'd been doing this, and I literally entered a business partnership with a company called Place. And Place is not a real estate brokerage. It's hard to describe. It's an operating system. So we operate from their tools, their systems, their technology, their leverage, their marketing that we help our clients sell their homes, and tools for our agents. But I love the word place. And it was very accidental because, that's the name of the company, right?
Yes.
Find your place.
But it means so much, Jeremy, because that when you really stop and think about it, everything starts with place. I mean, I don't mean to get too philosophical here.
Let's do it.
But I mean, we've got Zion National Park just an hour's drive away, and you go there and you get this sense of the creation.
Yeah. Yes.
And you get this sense of time, and you get this sense of, okay, we live on this earth, and here is our place. And for so many people, Zion is a sacred place, but everybody has their sacred place. And for the last 40 years, I've been grappling with this whole concept of a sense of place. Mm-hmm. And that's really been at the heart of my writing and my work. I think I grew up with a really heightened sense of place because my father is a storyteller. And whenever we were anywhere in this town, he would tell me a story that related to that place.
Incredible.
And so place and story became inextricably connected for me. And I think that's what has connected me to being here, to wanting to live here more than anywhere else on earth, even though I've traveled around the world and I know there are some really awesome places to live. But I'm connected to this place by the stories that create that meaning.
I love this. My father always says, so some of you know my dad, Dale Larkin, and Lyman and Dale are friends, and we're going to talk momentarily about your podcast, but he will always say, I've been all over the world and there are a lot of great places, but St. George is the best. Almost, it's an incarnation of what you just said, right? And I think what happened for me, this is kind of fun. I'll show you a photo. Now, I helped the photo a little bit because it was dark. So that was up on Owens Loop, and you can see my dog in the left, and you can see Zion National Park in the loop. So, Mal, we might want to, just for fun, in the middle of the show, edit this in. I wake up every day, and I live on Hope Street, like Hope right there, right?
Yeah.
And I walk 3 minutes is what it takes from my house with Max. Max is a 3-legged dog. It takes us 3 minutes to get to Brooks Pond. I bet you spent some time at Brooks Pond.
Yeah.
And then we hike. And some days it's 15 minutes because we're in a hurry. I basically have a 15, a 30, and a 60, right? Owens Loop in its entirety is about 60 minutes for us. And when you wake up in the morning and you catch the sunrise, I mean, that's creation, especially with Easter. And I sat on a rock, shut my eyes, and just had that moment, and cars are zooming across the parkway and people were frenetic, needing to go. It's actually kind of it's a paradoxical experience sitting there because the cars. But did you go to Brooks Pond as a kid?
I did, although I grew up clear down here on 600 South. It was a long way, a long, long way, all the way up Flood Street to the what we now call the Boulevard. We called it the Highway.
Okay, this is so good.
And to make
which we have on our stairs.
to make it all the way from 600 South on a summer day to the highway, and then across the highway, and then up onto the Red Hill. That was quite a trek for a little kid. But that was on those days when we did venture that far, we felt like we had come to the end of the earth.
I got a question. What was the address of the 600 South property?
465 East.
465 East, 6 South. Oh, I know exactly where that is. Of course I know where that is. Because we lived on 600 East.
Yes.
Until, 1985.
Yes. And speaking of place, my parents moved into that house as a new house in 1956. I was 1 year old. And they have lived there until last fall, basically 70 years. We just sold the home last fall. And so cool. My mom and dad, who are both in their 90s, my mom just passed away. My dad is still with us. But when you think about place, that house, they lived there 70 years. I grew up there. That there is something sacred about that place that is beyond expression. And but we ventured north. We'd get all the way to Brooks Pond and onto the Red Hill, or we ventured south. And 600 South was basically the end of town at that time. Mm-hmm. So we'd go down to what became 700 South, a dirt road. We'd ride our bikes all the way to what became River Road. We'd ride our bikes down River Road to the old trestle bridge across the Virgin.
I fully remember.
And when we crossed that Virgin River Bridge, we thought we were in another country. We had gone so far.
Yeah, Mal, if you knew, and I'm going to share something kind of fun here on this note you had, it's interesting when we say, from the beginning of time, people have said, well, the good old days. That's not just a cliche. There have always been good old days. And what's fascinating is this. Then the Boots Cox Dairy opened at 7th and 7th. And I know because we lived on 600 East, 525 South, 600 East, right by East Elementary. And then from 75 to 85, because I'm 50. At 10 years old, we moved to Morningside Park. And that's where Daryl lived. And down there, Randy Wilkinson and Tony Whitwer and Royden Whitwer and Kevin Entz and Dale and Daryl Larkin and Stuart Spendlove. I mean, the list goes on. And so the dairy was there, but they got rid of that and that became Little Caesars. But we would go, I have this story that I remember so well. When I was 12 years old, there was a family, the Brinkerhoffs, and they lived over by Harmon's. They lived basically where the Harmon's gas pump is. Mm-hmm. Randy Brinkerhoff. I went to his son Randall's birthday party. I was 12 and Randall was turning 11. And Randall got a little motorcycle, like a YZ80 120 motorcycle. And I remember that somebody got on it and went tearing off and they didn't understand the throttle. And they started going east in front of Harmon's, but there wasn't a Harmon's. Yeah. There was just desert. And remember how the road just turned? It just bent. Yeah. And I thought, he's going to ride off into nowhere. And when my dad went to Spain in 2000, this is a funny story. I don't know if he said this on the podcast with you. When he left for Spain in 2000 with Mom for 3 years as LDS mission presidents, he said, he tells me this story over and over. Do you remember me saying, I don't know, I feel like everything's been developed. I feel like he told Gray, I think all of the projects are done. Can you believe it? And he came home to Target and Lowe's. All that happened in front of Sky West from 2000, 2003. See, we think that was yesterday. That was almost 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
so crazy.
We sit here and young folks say, you're talking about the good old days. But what's really fun, Jeremy, is that this town is such an awesome place that for the youth right now, these are the good old days.
You
and
bet.
they will talk about these days the same way we're talking about our growing up days here, because they're having the same kinds of experiences and they're seeing change and they're remembering what it was like before. And that's an awesome thing to realize that really these are the good old days, and we should always make now the good old days. But it is fun to think about that. And I come back to this idea of place, and I think about where I'm sitting right now. In 1983, we started St. George Magazine.
I remember.
I partnered with Wally Brazil and Roland Lee, and we started a magazine to show off St. George and to tell the story of St. George. And really deep down, though I hadn't defined it yet, the mission was to help people develop a sense of place in St. George by knowing the history, by knowing the kinds of things that we're talking about today. And I remember after our first issue came out in the spring of 1983, I remember coming to this building. I think, would they have had a Chamber of Commerce meeting upstairs?
They could have. They could have.
There was some public aspect of it.
Well, because you remember that they used it as a wedding. Upstairs was a wedding venue.
There was some kind of meeting up there, and Mayor Carl Brooks was in that meeting, and I was at that meeting.
Oh, man.
And
so good.
Carl Brooks came up to me right here within 20 feet of where I'm sitting and said, "Lyman, that magazine is absolutely wonderful. And the piece that you wrote, that first person essay that you wrote about growing up here, is one of the best things I've ever read in my life." And that was life-changing for me. And so here I am, Jerry, haunted by this sense of place because I'm in the very building where Carl Brooks told me that. And it's interesting because when you think about where we are today as a city and what you're doing the same kind of thing that we were doing in a much more low-tech way with St. George Magazine, and telling these stories and sharing the beauty and the awesomeness of this place with people, and then seeing the results of it. Because when we started the magazine, the idea was, okay, we want to help promote all of this second home market and everything that's happening in the early 80s and through the 80s and into the 90s. But we didn't have a clue. We had no clue what it would become.
Well, it's funny. Do you remember it was St. George where the summer sun spends the winter?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, good grief. I am loving these stories. Side note, well, it's not a side note. It's an important note. We have this training room that I didn't even walk you into, but it seats 16 people really comfortably. You put 25 in there if you really wanted to, but for you and for the community, guys, we have this room available, and we've charged people a few times $50 and we would put it for whatever, but typically we don't charge anybody anything, but we allow people to come in here because we don't use it. It just sits there empty. So if you need a space to do something, I was looking at population, right? And I mean, can you imagine what St. George was in 1983 and I remember St. George Magazine. Of course I do. It was on my kitchen counter.
Well, your dad and uncle were great supporters of it through advertising and other support.
This is incredible. Okay, let me ask you a question about Not Forgotten. So, by the way, guys, if you just picked up the show, I've got Lyman Hafen on, who's a great family friend and well-known author and historian, and he's the host of the Not Forgotten podcast. We're going to run this thing to the top of the hour, what'll be 9 a.m. for our radio show. And then we're going to stay on. If you want to pick up the whole show, you're just going to look us up, the Larkin group, or go over to YouTube and you can see every episode that we do every week. Whose idea was it for you to start Not Forgotten, the podcast?
Well, it certainly wasn't mine because I didn't even know what a podcast was. But a couple of years ago, Brittany Booth Fonsbeck.
Oh yeah, sure.
Me.
It's too funny. I talked to Maureen on Sunday. We go to the same church building.
I didn't know Brittany. I knew of her because I knew she was Craig Booth's daughter, Doc Booth's daughter. And she called me and said that we're starting a foundation, the Doc Booth Foundation, because we lost Doc Booth a few years ago. And she said our objective is to raise money for scholarships, for students for college, and also for mental health support. And she said, what we'd really like to do to gain visibility for this foundation is start a podcast that would where people could tell their stories of this place. And she had a vision, and then I said, well, Brittany, I don't know what a podcast is really. I'm not involved in podcasts, but I'd sure like to find out. And it sounds like something that would really be neat. And it evolved from there.
It is so fun. How many episodes have been recorded?
I think this afternoon we'll do our 58th.
Incredible.
We're not close to 650.
No,
yet,
no. And it's funny when you look at the content we put out on the real estate side, a lot of it's just commentary about the real estate market. I think in hindsight, well, what's hindsight? I mean, hindsight is looking back with all the information that you never had. I mean, isn't hindsight's silly in a way, right? Meaning, well, I would have done it differently. Yeah, but we didn't. We isn't this a life lesson? So you've done 58 episodes. About a month ago, my dad and his brother Daryl were on, and it was so much fun. And we have 2 minutes, and then we're going to move into our other, and then we'll keep going, guys. If someone wants to find Not Forgotten, they're just going to go to YouTube, iTunes, Spotify.
Well, it's mainly available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Yeah.
I think it's available on YouTube as well. But really all you need to do is Google Not Forgotten, and then
comes right up.
And then the word Dixie will
it comes right up. It comes right up.
Further define it. And you can listen to it on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. It's thankfully for my part, it's audio only.
Yeah, you don't have to be on video.
I don't have to worry about those cameras.
It's paid off. I've launched a transformational coaching program for realtors nationwide, and I do it all on video on Zoom. And the beauty is it's really easy for me now.
Yeah.
That's what has been. I'm going to ask you one question before we wrap up the regular radio show. What's been in 60 seconds? Name what is the number one thing you've learned producing that podcast? What have you learned? What
I've learned is that there is a very common thread that runs through every conversation that we've had about the history and the people and the culture and the character of this area. And
I love that answer.
And that common thread is what we call the Dixie spirit. And it's defined in a lot of different ways. And you don't have to have been born here to know that or to feel that or to sense that. But there is that common thread, regardless of who we've talked to, of something special about this place. I know that every place is special, and the place that everyone was born is special.
Yep.
But there's a common thread running through this place and its stories that is pretty special.
So I love this, the Dixie spirit. It's funny. Most of our listeners don't know that my mother was Dixie. And I had a lot to say when I actually have an interesting perspective. I'm going to offer it unsolicited about the name change at Utah Tech, because I think a lot of people thought that with my mom's name being Dixie, that I would have been, no, you can't change it. I actually see why they changed the name. Again, I'm just going to give you my take. I actually like that they changed the name of the university because my opinion now from the outside, notice we're a proud supporter of Utah Tech. I think Utah Tech sounds more university. I think I think it is great for the school, for the community. And I love that we are preserving the Dixie Rock and the D on the Hill. And now the new Utah Tech president, you know what he's saying? He's saying, we're kind of bringing back some Dixie. And they've now got Dixie merchandise on the shelf. And I think two things can be true in life, can't they? That feel opposing. And I'm not saying I'm right, but my mother was Dixie. And I don't even know if they made the change for the right reason. I think at the end of the day, Utah Tech sounds better to grow the university. That's it. That's just my take. And I'm a graduate. I went to Dixie College. I went to Dixie High. I don't know. But the Dixie spirit is alive and well.
I respect what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. Mm-hmm. My feelings are a little different.
Sure.
But I think what's really important right now is where we go from here.
Yeah.
And it's really neat that that the word Dixie has not been eliminated, and there's no reason for that. And the thing, I served with Steve Snow. We were co-chairs of the Heritage Committee that the legislature appropriated some money to help maintain and perpetuate the legacy of Dixie on campus. Mm-hmm. And we had we met together for a year with the board of trustees. Your sister was.
She was there. She was there.
Was
Tiffany
chair
was
of
there.
that committee, and we had a very diverse committee there, and we with lots of different opinions about the name change and everything. But the great thing is that we had a charge to look at how we maintain and honor and perpetuate the legacy of Dixie itself, but of the word as well. And that's why we have, there was all the great initiatives to with the D on the Hill and the Dixie on the Sugarloaf, and the fact that this campus is still called the Dixie campus, and that's part of the signage. But what we did is we recommended that money be spent to create a monument in the encampment mall monument that is specific to telling the story of Dixie and the name Dixie and why and what and how that has been important in this community. We also used some of that money to hire an assistant librarian at the university whose charge is to curate and to compile and to bring together all things relating to Dixie and Dixie heritage.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
And then we also created, and I'd love to put a plug in here, we produced a film, a documentary film that Phil Tuckett was the director and editor of, and that it's an hour-long film that tells the whole story of Dixie, and that's you can Google. It's called Preservation and Progress.
Preservation and Progress.
The Dixie. I can't remember the subtitle, but use the word Dixie as well. The story of Utah's Dixie or something like that. Anyway, everyone should see that documentary because it tells the whole story of why the word and the name Dixie are sacred here.
It's so fascinating. And by the way, and I respect all the opinions about that Utah Tech. It was a funny situation having my sister on the committee, having my sister on the board of trustees. My mom was Dixie. My dad's feeling like he's kind of caught in the middle because a lot of the generation are we're kind of saying you can't change the name, and he's kind of trying to stay neutral. This Dixie spirit is a thing, and it's so hard to explain it to someone, right? You can't. We always talked about having the red sand between your toes, and I don't know. It's interesting, Lyman. I married a gal 8 months ago who lives in Lehigh, and I want to restate what I just said. Who lives currently in Lehigh? We don't live in the same home. It's a little bit complicated. And, her name's Jen Lambert. And it's been fascinating, her falling in love with this town. She always loved it because everyone from northern Utah loves St. George. We know this. That's why it's so dang busy. Yeah. But she has started to have this experience of, wow, there's just something magical. And she's getting, and I said, Jen, to be fair, you're getting an experience that's not actually the experience everyone has. And she said, what do you mean? I mean, she's kind of in these, not exactly said this, but kind of in her, I live on Hope Street by the Red Hill. I was born and raised here. So does this make sense, Lyman? It's a different filter having lived that I kind of see it through. I'm more than a guy that got excited about St. George and moved in. It's almost all I know.
Well,
I don't know. And I don't know what to do with that. I'm like, man,
that's an interesting perspective, Jeremy. I think, the idea of adoption is real.
Sure.
And you do not have to have been born here. You do not have to have grown up here.
Right.
To eventually come to have the same kind of feelings for this place as those who were born here. Mm-hmm. I think I've seen
because she's fallen in love.
I've seen that. And I realize it's different. It's through a different lens, but eventually it does come back to that common thread I was talking about, that eventually, whether you define it that way or whether you use that phrase or not, eventually, if you are sincere, you have captured the Dixie spirit.
Yeah, it's just, well, here's what I love. The Not Forgotten podcast that we talked about, and I didn't tell anyone that it's Not Forgotten Stories of Utah's Dixie. And there is something magical here. I love these references to St. George Magazine. I love this conversation about you growing up on 600 South. Tell me this. You've written a bunch of books. I love them. List off the ones that you really love you love them all, but what are some of these that you go, man, I really liked writing that one?
Well, the first book that was published that I wrote was the biography of Bruce Hearst.
Oh, I had it. I have it. I think it's somewhere in my house.
Flood Street to Fenway. That was written in 1987, the year after the 1986 World Series.
We're not going to talk about Billy Buckner. We're not going to have that conversation.
We would be here all day if we talked about that whole story. But it is such an awesome story of Bruce, who grew up just around the corner on 650 South. And he was a couple of years younger than me, but we were boyhood friends, and we grew up in the same neighborhood. And then there he is on the mound in Fenway Park, winning Game 1 of the World Series, winning pitcher, winning Game 3 of the World Series. No, excuse me, Game 5 of the World Series. And then after everything that happened in Game 6, where he would have been a World Series champion, would have been the World Series MVP, he came out and pitched and started in Game 7 and was leading when he was taken out of the game in Game 7. This is a boy who grew up around the corner here in St. George. And to me, that was the most wonderful, awesome, amazing story. And so that's where I kind of, Bruce was so cooperative in letting me interview him and talk to him for hours and hours. And that's where the idea of writing books started with me.
So he was born in 58. I wanted to see that.
Yeah.
Does he still have a place in Santa Clara?
No.
He did for a long time. Big home.
Yeah. But Bruce, talk about a great Dixie Boy story. That's pretty awesome. Anyway, after that, I started compiling a lot of my first person pieces that I wrote for St. George Magazine. I would adapt them and put them together. And 3 of my books consist of those stories about growing up in St. George. One of the books is called In the Shade of the Cottonwoods. That
one, by the way, just so you know, is like, it's a thing. That book for me is right here.
Well,
I love that book.
It's your childhood too. Just
These cottonwoods, the cottonwood trees. That is the interesting thing about my age. How old are your kids, by the way?
My oldest is 47.
Yeah. So at 50, I was the youngest. I was just old enough. You told the story about crossing the trestle bridge. So we were living in Morningside Park, and as you cross the bridge to your left, going south, there's a bunch of trees down there. We went down and built a tree fort in there.
Oh,
True
wow.
story. Me, and these are guys who are men in their 50s now. Kyle Blake, who's an appraiser, Patrick Dunleavy, who's my CPA, all these guys.
That is awesome.
And so, but there's so many memories. So so obviously Flood Street, from Flood Street to Fenway, In the Shade of the Cottonwoods, a couple of classics. When you write a book, how long would you have worked on those?
Well, the books where I've compiled pieces and adapted pieces, those came together over many, many years. Mm-hmm. I mentioned earlier that first piece that I wrote in St. George Magazine that Mayor Brooks complimented me on and gave me that extra spark of confidence that I continued to develop my writing voice through those pieces. And so, for example, In the Shade of the Cottonwoods, those are pieces that I wrote over a period of maybe 10 years and then brought it all together in a book. And so you could look at it that way. The more standalone pieces that I've done, my book about the Arizona Strip, Far from Cactus Flat, mm-hmm. which is a story of Lincoln Bundy, who was a World War II fighter pilot.
So cool.
And that book gave me the opportunity to write, kind of tell the story of the Arizona Strip and its amazing people, because it's basically an extension of the St. George story, only 60 miles straight south of here. And that book I worked on and researched over about a 2-year period. Mm-hmm. You got to remember, Jeremy, that I have a day job, and I had a day job through all of this. When I first started writing magazine articles at BYU as a senior, my professor said, "Lyman, you can do this. I can see that you can do this." But he said, "Always have a day job."
Kind of like, there's no money in this, buddy. Starving artist.
And I took that to heart, which my wife is so grateful for. I've always had a really good day job. For many of those years, it was as editor of St. George Magazine, mm-hmm. and that was a great vocation for many years. And then I became the executive director of the Zion Natural History Association mm-hmm. in Zion National Park, and that job made all the difference in my life professionally. Amazing. And so I was involved there for 25 years. But in the meantime, I'm writing these books. And so, if I were a full-time writer, they wouldn't have taken so long. But most of my books took, a few years to bring together.
There's something interesting also that we've run into in our real estate business with marketing, and there's a parallel. We came to find out, and I think you'll see it momentarily, you go out into the internet and you can have Instagram and your YouTube and you can have all these things. What we came to find out is it was tough to get you don't have, it was tough for us to get big reach because because what we're talking about is hyper local. And the same would be true for, because a full-time writer who writes about things across the planet, that's a big audience. Mm-hmm. When you're writing stories about, the Cactus Flat, and you see where I'm going, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You have a narrow audience. It's a small funnel. You're not going to sell. You're just not going to sell 10 million copies of In the Shade of the Cottonwood. It's just, we've run into this. We say, oh, we want to grow our Instagram. But the reality is, who are we talking to? People who want to live in St. George or buy and sell. That's kind of a small crowd.
It is. It's true.
The
thing that I've learned over the years, though, and it's not from a marketing standpoint, but just from the standpoint of story, is that our stories here are universal.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that.
And people relate to them everywhere. We just don't. We're not marketed to people everywhere because we're not. But I've gotten just as much positive feedback from readers on the East Coast, or podcast listeners on the East Coast, or folks around the world to different things that I've written, simply because the stories are universal.
Yeah.
And I think that St. George is that universal, quintessential place that if people know about it, they gravitate to it.
Yeah.
But it's true. The one breakthrough that I had as a writer in the early 90s, I wrote a novel for young readers called Over the Joshua Slope. And it's a story about a 12-year-old boy on a cattle drive. Quite autobiographical, but it's but I actually broke through in New York, and
wow.
It was published by Macmillan in New York, and it was marketed nationally. And yet, it's easy to come up with excuses, but the Macmillan, during the time that it was accepted and came together with Macmillan was subsumed into Simon & Schuster, and Simon & Schuster was subsumed into Paramount Media, and all of these things were happening. And my little book just kind of got lost in all of the fray. But the funny thing is that I've sold the copies, or I've sold as many copies of my locally published books as I did of my nationally published book.
Isn't that amazing?
So it's true. But then it really does come back. The product that you're selling and that I've been selling with my books is very localized, and yet it's universal. Its appeal is universal. The stories and the place.
Incredible. I got a couple of funny real estate questions. First home you ever bought here, do you remember what you paid for it?
Let's see. Well, this is really funny, Jeremy, because we still live in it.
Are you serious?
We've lived in our home. We built our home in Santa Clara, on the edge of the Heights in Santa Clara, in 1985.
You've been in that same home?
We still live there. We've remodeled, we've added, we're still doing things to make it our dream home.
What did that thing cost in 85? Do you remember?
I'm trying to remember. Debbie will have to.
Debbie?
I think it was in the 40 to 50,000.
I mean, it's just, which I would have guessed.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the internet is you can find all the averages pretty easily in a quick Google search. You can find out what home prices were in 90 and 2000. And, when we look at real estate today here, average sales price around St. George, true average, maybe even we better say median, it's pushing about $600,000. We talk a lot about real estate, on a weekly basis on our show. And I can tell you right now, I will pull up, I've got a couple of references, but when I look here, as we start to wrap this show up, we've got Lyman Hafen. This has been so much fun today. I can tell you what our average sales price has been this year. And we're in an interesting conundrum because, when you guys in the 80s were talking about St. George being a second hometown and location, well, guess what? At the time, we were begging people to come because we needed the commerce. Well, now today, average sales price for our team this year, the Larkin Group, $628,244.06. So, I mean, the conundrum, as you know, is getting young people. Well, honestly, we say young people, but with these home prices, it's young people now. In 10 years, it's going to be middle-aged people who can't afford to purchase a home, right? And look, people are trying to figure out Lyman's solutions for this, but I'm going to tell you right now, no one has one. I study homes and prices for a living. I get asked this all the time, and I tell them, there is literally everyone has an opinion. No one has a viable solution. Because the solutions look like the government stepping in and controlling everything, and well, people don't want that. Or they look like the real estate market crashes. Well, no one really wants that. I've said for the last 5 years, I said the greatest thing that could happen is a major just catastrophe in the real estate market and the prices drop 30%. People freak out because a lot of people would go negative. But in my mind, that's almost the only viable plan. And I don't know. I mean, look, there'd have to be a major economic event, right? In the world.
Yeah. It's really, that's really disconcerting because earlier we talked about the good old days, and I'm talking about the good old days when my house cost $58,000 or
Sure.
whatever, and then my mom and dad, our house on 600 South, I think that it was $10,000
Probably.
and those good old days, and then thinking about but now, right now is the good old days too, and yet it's kind of hard to really convince that it is because of
People
that.
are frustrated.
And yet, I remember when Debbie and I finished at the university, and it was 1979, 80. Interest rates were like...
That's when they went
14,
to 17.8. Well, and
I remember
the peak was about,
17%.
yeah, the peak was, I think when I looked at this, there's a Federal Reserve chart that said they hit almost 18,
And Jeremy, we came out of college saying, we will never be able to own a home. But somehow we did. Somehow, now we look at those as the good old days. We worked that out. And I keep thinking, okay, my kids who moved back to St. George from Boston during COVID, they were able to somehow get into a new home here down on almost to Arizona, those neighborhoods down there.
They are. I mean, some of my favorite lots in St. George right now are the ones where the fence at Desert Canyons is Arizona. Because think of that view. Yeah. That view is not. No one's developing that part of Arizona. It's just going to be desert.
But what I'm saying is, even as recent as 5 or so years ago, my daughter and their 4 children who had lived 10 years in Boston, they were somehow able to move back here, even during those COVID years. And it's like, okay. But then my youngest son, who's in school back east right now, I'm trying to think, if he decided to come back here,
what would he do?
How on earth would that happen? And yet, somehow it does.
How old is he?
He's in his mid-20s.
Mm-hmm. Look, a couple of things have changed, and we'll start winding up our conversation for time. One of them is you had a lot of dual income households.
Yeah.
When I got into real estate, I was 30 and I was the only breadwinner. And as I coach realtors, I use my origin story often in coaching. And I'll repeatedly say, I was 30 years old with a non-working spouse. I mean, I had to win, I think that's one thing that's changing is you have a lot of households where both spouses are working, or one is working, but the other has what we call a side hustle, anymore. And I don't know the solution, but I'll say this. St. George is not going to stop growing. we said this on a previous show, and in the last week, look around. It's wonderful. And when people say, I can't stand this traffic, which I referenced on last week's show. If I leave here about 5 o'clock, 5:15, this is pretty chaotic here on the boulevard. Yeah. But that's a couple of times a day. It's not California highway, the 5 or the 10 or the, those where it's not Interstate 15 through Salt Lake, Lyman, where with my wife living in Lehigh, I spent a lot of time in that area, and it's terrible. There's an accident, 10 accidents every day. So life's pretty good here, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I keep coming back to this, but we really do. We really always need to realize that these are the good old days. We talk about the past, and that's been my life's work, talking about the past. But it's important to realize that right now is what's important, and right now is special, and we're blessed to live here. We're blessed to be part of it. I think about my mom, and I can see her grave right where I'm sitting at this moment. She was a young mom in 1956 when she moved into that house on 600 South. And she's seen all of this, and she's 94 in early January when she passed away. And what she has seen happen here has been a little bit overwhelming for her. Well, actually very overwhelming for her. I remember I'd go visit her, and she'd say, Lyman, does anybody work in this town? I think they just all go out and drive around all day long. And that's her perspective. And she's just felt all of this come in around her. And yet, if not for what's happened here in the last 40 years, I don't think I would be living here. And we're very fortunate. We have to deal with all that change means, but we still live in a very good place, and we can still make it the kind of place where right now these are the good old days.
I think this is a great parting shot that you're sharing with, and you talked about your mom being laid to rest there. I went to see my mom yesterday across the street, and a funny reference coming back to the top when you said it might seem kind of morbid. I have loved having my building here. People know I have videos. I probably have 50 videos on social media where I'm walking and talking, and I'm in the cemetery, and I'll say, yeah, I'm in the cemetery. I'll kind of throw that in there. I love it. I love it because it reminds me of the sense of place. Yesterday, I had several calls to make. The weather was it stopped raining. I walked down a block, and I walked through the Dixie, Utah Tech campus, and made 5 or 6 phone calls on my AirPods. I just walked a few thousand steps and came back. That's pretty great, you know. Guys, Lyman Hafen has been with us. We want you to look up Not Forgotten, Stories of Utah's Dixie, and so good on iTunes, Spotify, all the places, YouTube. And your website is lymanhafen.com, right?
Yes.
Lyman Hafen.com. Brother, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you, Jeremy. This has been great.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Over and out, guys.